and play on 2nd and 10. That's his youth right there.
Tagovailoa trying to make up for it. Fires to the end zone. Touchdown! Alabama wins!
So today I'll be continuing with my college football game-by-game prediction and roster preview videos with the Ohio State Buckeyes. So starting on the offensive side of the roster, Ohio State averaged at 31.2 points per game last year, and they will have a new offensive coordinator, though, because Brian Hartline, the offensive coordinator from last season, left to take the head coaching job at South Florida. So Ryan Day hired an offensive coordinator from the NFL. Arthur Smith is his name, and he's expected to run a run-first offense. And last year when Day hired a defensive coordinator from the NFL, Matt Patricia, that obviously worked out pretty well to replace one of their best defensive coordinators they've ever had, Jim Knowles. And Brian Hartline wasn't near as good of an offensive coordinator last year for Ohio State as Jim Knowles was a defensive coordinator for them, and I expect Ohio State's offense to be good again because Ryan Day is still there and he's such a good offensive mind. I expect them to average at least as many points per game as they did last year this year. So at quarterback, Julian Sayin is a Heisman contender. I think he'll be a Heisman finalist again this year. So last year he threw for 3,610 yards and had a good 32-8 touchdown interception ratio and completed 77% of his passes, which I think is the best in history, and averaged a really good 9.2 yards per throw. The only problem with Sayin, though, is he can't run at all. He had negative yards rushing. And at wide receiver, they're in really good shape. Again, now Brian Hartline was the wide receivers coach too, and the best in the country at it. So while Ryan Day, of course, is the head coach, deserves most of the credit for the development of their wide receivers and having all those first-round picks, Brian Hartline certainly did deserve some credit for it too. But so you do wonder if their wide receiver development might take a little bit of a step back with him leaving. But they lose Carnell Tate, who went first round, which is normal for Ohio State to lose a first round wide receiver. But they return the best wide receiver in the country, Jeremiah Smith, and maybe the best player in the country. I think he's a Heisman contender. Ohio State is the only team in the country, except for maybe Ole Miss, to have two Heisman contenders on the same team. So Jeremiah Smith was even better last year than he was as a freshman, and he could have been good enough to play in the NFL as a freshman. So last year he played in 13 games and had 87 catches for 1,243 yards and 12 touchdowns, averaging 14.3 a catch.
See if they take a shot here. Howard looking to launch right down the middle. Smith is wide open. Too easy.
And they've still got Brandon Enos, who was a 5-star wide receiver, and this will be his 4th year in college, but he never has gotten to play much because he's always been behind amazing wide receivers like Marvin Harrison, Emeka Ibuka, Jeremiah Smith, and Carnell Tate. But last year was the biggest year he's had so far in college, and even then he only had 36 catches for 271 and 3 touchdowns. But I expect with Tate leaving for Ennis to now be wide receiver number 2 behind Jeremiah Smith and have a big year. And he's talented enough to be a first-round draft pick. And they bring in a good wide receiver from UTSA, Devin McCoon, who started 12 games and played in 12 games for them last season, and had 65 catches for 726 and 8 touchdowns, averaging 11.2 a catch. He's expected to be a starting wide receiver for Ohio State this year. And something not uncommon is Ohio State also has a 5-star true freshman wide receiver coming in. His name is Chris Henry, and I expect him to be a contributor immediately. So at running back, they're in good shape with Bo Jackson coming back. He played and started 13 games for them at running back last year and had 1,090 yards and 6 touchdowns and averaged a really good 6.1 a carry. And he had 600 plus yard games on 179 carries. Now on the offensive line, this was the one position for Ohio State last year where they weren't quite good enough to be able to win a national title. They had plenty good enough wide receivers and running backs and a more than good enough defense and quarterback to do it. And while their offensive line played really well in the regular season, it really struggled in those 2 games at the end where they lost. Now it is going to be one of the most experienced offensive lines in the country this year, but it will be good. But the question is, can they take that next step and become elite? So they've got Austin Severfeld, or whatever his name is, coming back at left tackle, who started all 14 games for them and didn't allow a sack all year and only allowed 15 quarterback pressures. And they return at left guard Luke Montgomery, who started all 14 games for them and allowed only 3 sacks and 10 quarterback pressures. And they return at center Carson Hintzman, who started all 14 games and only allowed 1 sack and 16 total quarterback pressures. And they return at right tackle Philip Daniels, who only allowed 2 sacks and 19 quarterback pressures. He started all 14 games for them last year. Also, the right guard is the only spot where they won't return a full-time starter. So now on the defensive side, they were the best in the country statistically last year. They gave up on average only 7.9 points per game and allowed 17 or less offensive points in every game. And while you can't expect them to match that again, because there's only been, I think, 2 defenses in college football history that have been better than that statistically. With Matt Patricia back at defensive coordinator, I do expect Ohio State to have at least a top 5 defense again. I think it was actually the 3rd best defense in the country last year, behind Indiana and Miami, because Ohio State's defense did benefit some from an easy schedule. So on the defensive line, against the run, they gave up on average only 89.4 rushing yards per game, and it's going to be hard to match that again, losing Caden Curry and Caden McDonald, 2 NFL draft picks. But I do expect them to come close to that average because they do have Kenyatta Jackson coming back, who started all 14 games for them and had 28 tackles and 6.5 sacks and 32 total quarterback pressures and also 2 pass breakups. And they bring in 2 5-star defensive linemen from Alabama, James Smith and Q Rusaw. So Smith played in 13 games and started 12 games for Alabama last year and had 28 tackles and 2.5 sacks and 11 quarterback pressures and a pass breakup. And Russaw didn't play much last year because of an injury, but in 2024 he played in 13 games and started 6 games and had 36 tackles and a sack and 13 total quarterback pressures and 2 interceptions and a forced fumble. And at linebacker, they lose 2 first-round picks, Sonny Styles and Arvell Reese, so have to expect them to take a little bit of a step back there at least. But they do have Peyton Pierce coming back, a 4-star linebacker who was a rotational player last year, but was still a good contributor, having 44 tackles and a forced fumble and a fumble recovery and an interception. And they bring in a good linebacker from Wisconsin, Christian Allegro. He played in 22 games and started 11 games these past 2 years for Wisconsin and had a total in that of 119 tackles, 7 sacks, 2 pass breakups, and 16 total quarterback pressures. And then in the secondary, they gave up only 129.7 yards passing per game, which ranked first in the country a year ago. And there's no way you can expect them to match that, but I do expect the secondary to be elite again. So at cornerback, they lose Davis and Igbenogson, but they do get back Jermaine Matthews, one of the best cornerbacks in the country. He had last year in 14 games, 26 tackles, 3 pass breakups, 2 interceptions, and a sack and a forced fumble. And they bring in to try to replace Igbenogson Cam Calhoun, a 4-star corner who spent last year at Alabama but didn't get to play much. But the year before that, he was at Utah, and he only started 1 game for them but played in 11 games and had 21 tackles and a team-high 9 pass breakups and also an interception. And then safety, there's no replacing Caleb Downs, and they also lose Lorenzo Styles, but they do get back Jalen McLean, who had last year 53 tackles and 3 pass breakups, and they bring in 2 really good safeties through the portal, Earl Little, 4-star safety who started his college career at Alabama but couldn't really get on the field much, so he transferred to Florida State where he had a good year last year. In 12 games, he had 76 tackles and 4 interceptions and 2 pass breakups and 2 forced fumbles. And they bring in from Duke Terry Moore, who didn't play at all last year because of a torn ACL, but 2 years before that, he was a big contributor for Duke's secondary. And in 2024, he started all 13 games for them and had 71 tackles and 6 pass breakups and 4 interceptions and 2 forced fumbles and was an All-American. So starting with Ball State, this will be a game that Ohio State should be able to win by however much they want. They should be able to put in their backups at halftime. So now on the road at Texas, the first huge game of several this season for Ohio State. And before I give my prediction for it, I want you to know I had a really tough time on it. I was back and forth with my prediction for this game, but Texas is so loaded this year that it makes me wonder that if they don't win it all this year, when and if Sarkisian ever will win it all. And they're so loaded to the point that if Texas does lose 3 games again and miss out on the college football playoff, which Ohio State would probably have to win this game for that to happen, it makes me wonder if they would fire Sarkisian or I think he'd at least be very much on the hot seat going into 2027. But I didn't have him on my list of hot seat coaches because I see almost no chance of that happening. And I know you may be thinking it's the same old Texas hype every year and they never win at all, but this is my third year of doing these videos, and well, I've been high on Texas both of the first 2 years of doing them. I've never picked them to win it all. Actually, in my first year of doing them, 2024, I correctly picked Ohio State to win it all. And while it is true that Texas has had loaded rosters these past 3 years, not on this level. And if you watch my Texas video that I'll do soon, you'll see what I mean. This is at least their best roster under Steve Sarkisian, and probably their best roster ever. So I think that Ryan Day is better than Steve Sarkisian, and I know Ohio State has beat Texas the last 2 years, but I think this will be a lower scoring game again, but not like last year where it was almost an offenseless game. I think it'll be like a 24-21 type of game. But it really just came down to home field advantage for me. So I'm going to say that Texas finally beats Ohio State. Kent State, this is one of those games that Ohio State should be able to win by however much they want, and they'll be able to put in their backups at halftime. So now Illinois. So now Ryan Day has been at Ohio State exactly as long as Urban Meyer was there. And I know it's debatable which one is better, but I actually think even though Urban Meyer won a national title sooner at Ohio State than Ryan Day did, that Ryan Day is a better coach than Urban Meyer was, because he never loses games like this one, because Illinois is a team that, while Ohio State has a big talent advantage over them, they are disciplined and well coached, and they play tough at the line of scrimmage. So if Ohio State had this talent level and just an average coach, there would be a very good chance that they could lose this game. Now, I'm not saying Urban Meyer was an average coach. He was really good, but not on the level of Ryan Day. And the final score to this game last year was 34-16. And I don't think Ohio State will blow out Illinois, but I expect a similar score to last year's. So Iowa, this one may be competitive because Iowa may be able to slow down Ohio State's offense. But the problem for Iowa is while their offense has been improving in recent years, it's only because they've been able to score more on not that good of defenses. When it comes to elite defenses like Ohio State, they still haven't been able to do hardly anything offensively, and I expect that to continue in this game. The only way I could see Iowa scoring more than 10 points is if their special teams or defense gets them a score, and I do expect Ohio State to at least score 20 points in this game, so I've got to go with Ohio State to get this win. So now Maryland. So there's too much of a talent and coaching advantage for Ohio State over Maryland for Maryland to stand a chance in this game. The line of scrimmage alone is going to be too much of a mismatch for Maryland to have a chance of even hanging around in this game. This is going to be a big blowout win for Ohio State. So on the road at Indiana. So if you watch my Indiana video from the other day, you already know who I'm picking in this game. But both of these teams are very similar. Defensively, I'd say they're about even, and quarterback, I'd say, is about even, and I'd say their wide receiver and running back rooms are about even. But offensive line is the one position where I think Indiana does have a little bit of an advantage over Ohio State, and that was really the big reason why they beat Ohio State last year. And it really, though, came down to home field advantage for me. I think Indiana will get the win by about a field goal and what'll be another low-scoring defensive battle. So on the road at USC, so like I said with Indiana last video, the same thing goes with Ohio State. To have a chance to beat them, you're going to have a really good defense, I think. And while USC's offense, I think, will be good enough to get into the low 20s on Ohio State, I don't trust Lincoln Riley to put a defense on the field that can hold Ohio State under 35 points. So I do think this will be a competitive game, but I think in the fourth quarter, Ohio State pulls away and wins it by a couple of touchdowns. So Oregon is a team that's similar to Texas and how loaded their roster is. So at the line of scrimmage in this game, Oregon, I think, has a clear advantage on the defensive line, but I think Ohio State has a little bit of an advantage on the offensive line, and Oregon can match Ohio State, I think, at the wide receiver and running back positions. But while quarterback is close, I do like Julian Sayin a little bit more than I do Dante Moore, and the rest of the defense besides the line I'd say is pretty similar. So this is another one I was back and forth on my pick for that really just came down to home field advantage, which is why I'm going with Ohio State to win by like a field goal and what'll I think be a lower scoring game, but not an offenseless game, probably in the low 20s. So Northwestern, so the same thing I said about Northwestern in the Indiana video goes with Ohio State. Even if Chip Kelly is able to come up with a good game plan, Ohio State's defensive line I think is going to dominate the Northwestern offensive line to where they still won't be able to score much, and it's going to be extremely hard for him to come up with a good game plan anyway on Ohio State because Ryan Day knows his offense so well, and Northwestern I don't see being able to get very many stops on Ohio State's offense, so I think this is going to be a blowout for Ohio State. So now Nebraska. So Nebraska's offensive line, I think, is really going to struggle to create holes to run for their running backs in this game. And while I do think Nebraska could be a pretty good passing team, I think their offensive line is also really going to struggle with the Ohio State pass rush. So I think they're going to have a really hard time keeping drives going and won't be able to score much. And while like I said in the Indiana video, I think Nebraska could have a good secondary. You can't just double cover Jeremiah Smith and take away Ohio State's passing game. They're too loaded at wide receiver for that, and I don't think Nebraska can slow down Ohio State's run game at all. So I think Ohio State shuts their offense down and is able to score quite a bit in this game, and it's a blowout. So now Michigan. If Bryce Underwood doesn't improve a lot, the only hope I see Michigan having against Ohio State is if they can do what they did the year before last and make it extremely low scoring. And while I do think Michigan will slow down Ohio State's offense, and it'll be a fairly low scoring game, I don't think they can shut them down like they did the year before last because while Michigan isn't short of talent on their defensive line, they don't have anyone like those two monsters that they had in the middle of the defensive line that year, Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, who pretty much won them that game by themselves. And Ohio State, if they really are 9-2 going into this game, is going to be under a lot of pressure because this would likely be a win or you're out of the college football playoff game, even with all the talent they have and as tough a schedule as they've had. And I don't see them losing under that kind of pressure, especially not at home. But I do think the game will be closer than it was last year. So my prediction for Ohio State is 10-2 overall and 8-1 in the conference. So they should for sure get them back to the college football playoff and likely back to the Big Ten championship. So that'll be it with this video. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.